All right, so here we are. We finally have got, I think, enough background that we can begin to think about communities and community structure. As usual, there's relatively little in your textbook on this topic, which is a huge part of ecology, but there's a little bit in there that's useful. And I want to really draw your attention. You should have got an email, I think, on the 20th of April to do the course evaluation. I think you get to do each of us separately in the class. And so please do the evaluation. Usually less than half the students do it, but we really do use your feedback to make changes each year based on things you liked and things you didn't like. And our bosses use these to sort of evaluate us. And so all of this is useful. It's your chance to have a say anonymously in what you think about the class. So please do that and know that it matters. All right, so here's the definition of the community that I gave way back at the beginning of my section, where we defined a community as a group of populations from multiple species in a defined area. And I've been using these pictures throughout, right? So here's a grassland community in Illinois that maybe has about 100 species in this picture, or a picture of boreal forest in northern Canada that maybe only has a couple dozen species, right? But all of them have populations that overlap in a defined area. And the key then is to think of this in terms of population persistence, right? But now we're not studying one population or a couple populations. We're potentially studying hundreds of populations and how they coexist. And if you remember, we talked about how biotic interactions shape population dynamics, right? And I gave you some really simple examples. So here are some, I think, in the cooperation or mutualism lecture, I gave you these three categories of beneficial interactions. Mutualism, synergism, commensalism. So you've seen these before. I'm not going to give you the definitions, but you should know these. We also talked about the negative interactions, right? Competition is a sort of minus-minus interaction. Parasitism and predation in the enemy attack. It's a bit confusing to think of it this way, but it's kind of a minus-plus relationship, right? It's bad for the prey, but it's good for the predator to have enemy attack. And then I want to give you a couple new terms just to round out the different ways, right? We can have neutralism, although we don't talk about it very much, right? A lack of interactions between two populations is totally possible. If we go out to an ecosystem around here, eagles and earthworms probably don't care that much about the population size of each other because they just don't interact. And commensalism, where it's sort of it's the flip side of commensalism. So in commensalism, one organism is harmed by the interaction, but it's sort of neutral to the other. So if you remember, commensalism was when one organism was inadvertently helping the other, and it didn't really matter to the one organism, but it was positive to the other. This is just the opposite. It doesn't really matter to the one. It's not doing anything on purpose, but it's accidentally harming the other species. You could sort of think of this as a gradient from beneficial to harmful with neutral in the middle, just to round things out. And I'll give you this little sort of study table, which you can print out to try to think about the sort of 9 different ways that this table can be filled out. And some of them are duplicated, right? So if we were together in a group, I would ask you to, fill this in with me, right? So what's the minus-minus interaction? You should know this table potentially, right? It's competition. Both organisms are hurt in competition. Right? And mutualism or synergism are kind of in this plus-plus category where both organisms are helped. And the difference between these two, according to your textbook, is whether or not it's an obligate relationship or not. Mutualisms are obligate, according to your textbook. Synergisms are sort of optional, but they're plus-plus. Neutralism, right? 0-0, nobody cares. Or eagles and earthworms don't interact, and they don't care how many, eagles don't care how many earthworms there are. Plus minus, right? Again, it's a little bit confusing, but predation and parasitism are positive for the predator and negative for the prey. So that gets kind of duplicated in these corners. So we call a triangular matrix. It's the same. The top triangle and the bottom triangle are the same. And we get commensalism and commensalism in these other two, right? So really, it's just one side of this triangle matrix that you need to be able to understand. So maybe print off a blank version and see if you can fill it in. And so we come to the concept of the community, right? And I've showed you this slide before. Every place on Earth is shared by organisms. These are tied together in all of these interactions that we've talked about, from positive to minus. And they're limited by characteristics of the environment in ways we've seen. And the key is to think about how all of these interactions shape population sizes and therefore coexistence, right? If population sizes of overlapping species can be positive, then they're going to coexist. If if one of them is going to go to 0 through competitive exclusion, then they cannot coexist. And so just to give you a sense of the complexity of this, right? So, communities are incredibly complicated. There's a reason I've been putting this off to really give you a foundation in the way that species interact, right? If you imagine that each species is a variable in a system of interactions, then communities can be thousands of dimensions. And it's weird to think of it that way, but you really do need to think of a community as a multidimensional world where each population size or density is a variable in a multidimensional system, right? So I showed you this equation, which you don't need to know, in the lab this week, right? So if you imagine there are S species, then there are P possible pairs of interactions where P is calculated this way. This is actually a common formula. It's like S choose 2. You can actually, if you wanted to have how many triplicates there are, you could put a 3 down here instead of a 2. If you wanted to know how many interactions of 4 species there are, you could put a 4 down here and so on. Right, so Purdue's Ross Reserve, where we did last week and this week's lab, there's about 50 tree species, and so P is about 1,225 possible pairs of interactions between the trees. That doesn't count like situations where one tree might be shaded by 3 other kinds of species. Right, but we can keep going. There aren't only trees out there, right? If I just pick some numbers out of the air, there might be about 100 understory species. So then P goes to 11,000, 111,000. Sorry, it should be 11,175. That's a typo. Let's add 20 invertebrates and maybe 100 invertebrates. We go up to 36,000 and change possible interactions. Maybe 200 microbes, we get 110,000 dimensions. Or possible pairs of interactions, right? So how do you describe a system with hundreds of thousands of potential interactions and hundreds of dimensions? It's hard. It's complicated, right? We're way past rocket science with community ecology. It's an incredibly complicated system. So let's start at the beginning with 2 more dead white dudes. And this is known as the Clements and Gleeson debate. This is actually, remember I hinted that Arthur Tansley was weighing into a debate that had been raging for a while when he coined the word ecosystem. This was the debate. And the debate was that there were 2 extreme concepts of the community, the closed community concept and the open community concept. And we're going to talk about these in turn, and then again use the scientific method to figure out what we think the world looks like. So Clements, this stern little fellow here, he argued that communities should be perceived as discrete units with sharp boundaries. So this grassland community is a discrete kind of thing. And he argued that there was organization above the level of the species. And he thought of the community as a bit of a superorganism, where species are analogous to the organs of the system. And so instead of thinking of a grassland as just a bunch of overlapping populations, he said, no, this is a superorganism that's different from the superorganism in the background of this forest. They have discrete boundaries and discrete differences. And the reason why this would matter, right, if you start to think about how you would understand a closed community, is that, you'd be limited in what you could understand about my kidney if you took my kidney outside and didn't realize that the blood vessels around it were actually important to the function of it, right? The kidney functions as a whole inside of my whole body, and that to understand the kidney, you need to understand the blood, you need to understand the food I'm eating, you need to understand a lot of things that are not particularly part of the kidney. And that's what Clements would say about this purple coneflower here, that you can't understand it without understanding everything around it. Gleeson, on the other hand, was an advocate of what he called the open community concept. And he just suggested, look, it's a chance group of species that are found in one area because they happen to have adaptations that let them live there. Right, there's no meaningful organization above the level of species. Organisms definitely interact, but you can sort of add and subtract species and then you'll still have a community, right? So you could basically, you can't, under Clements' view, you can't like replace the kidney with a heart. But under Gleason's review, you could potentially take the purple coneflower out and put in some other kind of species, and maybe that's fine. And so these make different predictions about the distribution of species, right? So an ecotone is defined as a region of rapid species replacement. You can kind of see an ecotone in the background here, where suddenly there's a forest going on. My guess is that this particular field, it has to do with like what humans did. So probably humans cleared this field and then didn't clear that field, but I don't know for sure. Right, so if you look at an environmental gradient, And each of these sort of lines is meant to be the distribution of a different species. Under the closed community concept, species would be in defined regions, right? So you would have a community here composed of these 4 species, and a completely different community composed of these 4 species. And in the same way that like insects and mammals have different organ systems, these are 2 discrete superorganisms with very different structure, very different organs or species. Whereas the Gleeson idea of open communities was like, look, you can have maybe this species has a really wide distribution, this one has a really narrow distribution, and you get ecotones still, but they're maybe a little bit more smooth, they're a little bit less obvious. In reality, you know, as many things as in ecology, communities really have features of both open and closed communities. Ecotones do sometimes exist, but at the same time, species distributions often blur together. This sort of debate still occurs today, although it's not as sort of raging as it was back at a couple centuries ago. But I would argue that most data supports that communities largely have open structures. So if we use our scientific method and do observations, we see much more smooth ecotones instead of abrupt ecotones. If we see ecotones at all, and then you could go back to jack pine, right? Our old friend jack pine. This is the distribution of jack pine. It lives in lots of different communities, right? The forests of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are very different than the forests of the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. You know, there are mountains up here. Here, there's, you know, salt spray and all kinds of stuff. You know, the forests at the Indiana sand dunes, even the soils are wildly different, right? So jack pine is part of a community down in the Indiana sand dunes that is wildly different from the community in the Northwest Territories, and each of those is wildly different from the community in Nova Scotia, right? So if I would argue if Clements was right, we should see a much narrower distribution of a species like jack pine, but instead we see something much more like what Gleeson saw. And so going back to Clements and Gleeson, just an interesting footnote about the history of this. It turns out that Clements was kind of a jerk, and he actually was so mean to Gleeson to try to win the argument that ultimately Gleeson sort of quit science because he just couldn't take how mean Clements was. And then basically, I think it was after Clements passed away that we started to really move away from his idea. So this is one of those things where you can get, you know, a toxic personality can actually shape scientific debate through that toxicity. Newton was a bit like this, right? Newton invented calculus, but he wouldn't share it with anyone until Leibniz sort of independently discovered it, and then, you know, he put it out. Anyway, that's a bit of a historical debate. So communities are probably much more like open systems than closed systems. And we'll talk about invasive species at the end of this lecture, and I think that the existence of invasive species should probably tell you that there's pretty broad support for the concept of the open community. So we're going to stop the video here, and we'll talk about different kinds of filters that filter species out of communities.